Yoma, Daf Hey through Yud Aleph. On Daf Hey, the Gemara says, Ketzad Halbisha. The priestly vestments, the Big Kahuna, when they put them on Aaron and his sons, how do they do it? How do they put them on? So the Gemara says, My Dahava Hava. That's ancient history. It happened a long time ago. Why is that relevant? So the Gemara says, our question is, Ketzad Malbisha and La'asid Lavo. How will we do it in the future? The Gemara says, in the future, in the time of the redemption. So Aaron and Banav and Moshe will come, and then we'll know what to do. So the Gemara says, Ela Ketzad Hilbisha and Lamizbar Kroy Pligi. We're going back to the first thing, that it was a historical question. What did they do back then, in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu? But the question was, Mai Dahava Hava, it's just history. The answer is, Lamizbar Kroy, we're trying to explain Psukim. Rashi explains there's an apparent contradiction in the Psukim, and the Gemara goes on to discuss it. So the implication of this Gemara seems to be, my dahava hava, we don't discuss historical questions unless there is either some practical significance or it has to do with how to explain psukim. The Gemara in Chulin, the Gemara brings a question. Rav Yirmiyah had a question. Basar nechira, meat that was not shechted, it was prohibited when the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael. It was permitted before that. So the Gemara raises the question, so what was the halacha of Basar Nechira that the Jews had in their possession that they brought with them into Eretz Yisrael? Did it become Asur or not? And the Gemara says, Teku. The Gemara has no answer. So that was a long time ago. Why do we care? So Rashi says, Drosh v'kabel schar, that it's important to lamad al ha'emes, it's important to know the truth. Even though it's a matter of history, it's still important to know the truth. What was the halacha back then? Back in the time when the Jews entered Eretz Yisrael? The Rosh says, Lo Nehira, that's not correct. Our Gemara indicates there's no such thing, my Dahava Hava, unless it's a question of how to resolve problems in the Psukim, unless it's important to understand the text of the Torah. If it's just history, the Gemara does not raise such questions. The Gemara does not ask questions if they're only of historical import. So the Rosh says we have to say that there are practical ramifications. What are the practical ramifications? So he says one example is if a person makes a neder, and the neder takes effect from a certain time, and he already has in his possession that type of, let's say he makes a neder on meat or a specific type of food, and he already has something in his possession at that time, do we say that it's that becomes usher, or do we say whatever he had stays mutter, just like Basar Nechira that the Jews brought into Eretz Yisrael? Alternatively, he says, let's say Beis Din, forget not a personal neder, let's say Beis Din makes a gzera, Beis Din makes a new prohibition. We want to know, does the prohibition only take effect with regard to new foodstuffs that are produced, or does it even take effect on food that already existed? That's the issue of Basar Nechira, because it does have halachic ramification. So that question is not just a question of history, it has actual practical nafkaminas in halacha l'maisa. On Davav, the Gemara brings a debate, different possibilities, a machlokas, whether the avneit of the Kohen Gadol is identical to the avneit of the Kohen Hedyot. The avneit is one of the four garments, the sash, the belt of the Kohen Hedyot. It's one of the four garments that he wears. The Kohen Gadol wears 8 garments. The question is, was their avneit the same or different? The Kohen Gadol's special begadim certainly were different. The choshen, the me'il, the tzitz, there's nothing like that in the Kohen Hedyot. But the avneit, they both wore an avneit, and the question was the avneit of the Kohen Hedyot identical to that of the Kohen Gadol or not? Rashi explains that if the avneit was different, the difference would be that the avneit of the Kohen Gadol was kilayim, because it had both wool and linen, and the avneit of the Kohen Hedyot was only linen. So the Gemara brings machlokas about it, and the other opinion said they're both kilayim. The Rambam and most poskim paskin that the avneit of the, again, paskin is a tricky word because it's not really halacha l'maisa, we don't have big dekuna today, but the Rambam and those who follow him generally assume that we paskin that the avneit of the Kohen Hedyot is like the avneit of the Kohen Gadol, and it was kilayim. The Rambam says that the Kohen Hedyot has only 4 begadim. The Rambam says that the 3 out of the Kohen Hedyot's 4 begadim were just linen, but the avneit actually had semer in it as well. The Kesef Mishnah brings another Gemara later in our Masechta and Daf Yud Beis, that the Gemara brings Machlokas Tanaim, that the Gemara says that the avneit of the Kohen Hedyot, Rebbe says it was kilayim, Rebbe Elazar Shimon says it was linen. The Yadua that the halacha is like Rebbe, that the avneit was kilayim. There still is a machlokus, however, whether the avnei to there is a machlokus among the later poskim, whether the avnei to the Kohen Hediot was fully like the avnei to the Kohen Gadol, with all the different tcheles, vargaman, and all that, or whether we say that it only had 1 min of tzemer. The Ralbag, in his commentary to the Torah, the Ralbag says that Ralbag brings the opinion that Meleches HaAvneitim was not like the Kohen Gadol, was different from the Kohen Hediot. He said Chazal knew this from observation. It wasn't just halacha. Chazal knew the Avneit was different. But even though it was different, the Ralbag explains, he says, how is it different? That the Avneit to the Kohen Gadol was more beautiful, it was more elegant, he says. However, the Avneit to the Kohen Hediot also only had 1 min, but it had semer. So the Ralbag does say that it had semer, but it only had 1 min, didn't have all the different colors and so on of the Avnei to the Kohen Gadol. Rikiv Eger says, Kipshuto, he brings in Mishnah Lamelech, that the Avnei to the Kohen Hediot was mamish, was exactly like the Avnei to the Kohen Gadol. It had 4 minim, it had tcheles, it had the other minim, the other different types of colors that the Avnei of the Kohen Gadol had. So why is this so relevant? We don't have the Avnei today. This is not just a question of Mai Dahava Hava. This is not just a question of Hilchos El Mashicha. This actually has a significant practical ramification. In the 19th century, when Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer led a campaign to re-implement the temple service, so one of the questions that arose was, can we make proper Bigdei Kahuna? Rikveger in one tshuva even indicates that we need a Kohen Gadol for the tzitz. We've discussed that previously, but even if we assume that we can get by with a Kohen Hediot, so 3 of his garments are just linen, that's easy. The question is, what do we do for the Avneit? The Rambam says the Avneit was Kilayim. So Kilayim certainly you can only make if it's a kosher, one of the Bigdei Kahuna, and we have to know how to make the Avneit. Did it have tcheles vargaman? Did it have just one kind of tzemer? If it had tcheles and argaman, we may have to know what tcheles and argaman is. For 1,000 years, the Jews didn't have tcheles. Today, there are schools of thought that we do know what tcheles is, but in Rick Reger's time, he said we don't know what tcheles is. And what about argaman? There are also other disputes about how to construct the Avneit. He brings that the Ravid says that arug, argaman, the word argaman comes from the word arug. It means it was a hybrid type of fiber made out of 2 or 3 different colors. That's why it's called argaman. Others say argaman is purple. So Rick Reger says all these problems, all these different opinions about how to construct an Avneit, it was kilayim, it had tzemer, it had several minim of tzemer. There are all kinds of different opinions, he says. There are also machlokus whether it has to be blue like tcheles. Does it have to actually have the chilazon, the full-blown tcheles that we use for tzitzis? Is it enough that it's blue? He says that the Rambam is mashma that chilazon is a unique requirement for tzitzis, but the Avneit, Mekev's Mishnah suggests the Avneit wouldn't have to have actual chilazon as long as it's blue. However, Rashi implies that you need the dam chilazon. So Rikvegi says, what are we going to do? We don't have the chilazon. We're not sure what our gaman is. Because of all these disputes, this was one of Rabbi Kiveger's many objections to the plan of his student, Rav Kalischer, to bring karbanos bisman hazeh. Rabbi Kiveger said, the other begadim of the Kohen Hediot we can construct, but the Avneit is difficult because the Avneit depends on all these different disputes. On Daf Zayin and Daf Ches, the Gemara discusses the tzitz. The tzitz was the forehead plate the Kohen Gadol wore made out of gold. So it says the tzitz, the Torah uses the word tamid. So the question is, what does the word tamid mean? The Gemara brings different interpretations. So the Gemara discusses whether if the tzitz, if he's not wearing it, if it's not odu al mitzcho, if it's hanging from a peg on the wall, is it marateh, is it not marateh? Does it give a kapara for karbanos that were brought betumah or not? The Gemara goes back and forth on that. The Gemara brings another explanation of what tamid might mean. It says tamid shleisiach dai tomimenu. There's a halacha, the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to mesiach das. He can't get distracted. He can't cease focusing on the fact that he's wearing a tzitz that says Kodesh Lashem, Hashem's name on it. And the Gemara says, even tefillin, not even tefillin, but kol shkein tefillin, kal v'chomer tefillin. A person has to touch, to caress, he has to touch his tefillin all the time, whenever he remembers that he's wearing tefillin. Kal v'chomer mitzitz. We might have thought that the tzitz is the Kohen Gadol wears it, great kedusha, it's special, but the Gemara says, no, on the contrary, the tefillin that you wear every day has even more kedusha than the tzitz, because the tzitz only has one Shem Hashem, askara achas. The Torah says, tamid shleisiach daito, think about it all the time. Tefillin has many askaros, alachas kama v'kama, a person has to be mashmei, she has to touch it and remember it, and not be mesiach das. We pass in this way in Shulchan Aruch. A person has to touch his tefillin all the time, so he shouldn't be mesiach das. First the shalyad, then the shalrosh. The Mishnah Berurah explains that because shalyad is closer, and mavir and ala mitzvahs, whenever you remember you're wearing tefillin, you touch it to remember that you're wearing tefillin, and you shouldn't be mesiach das. While you're davening, you don't have to. While you're davening, we're not worried about this. Hesach hadas. There is a major machlokus among the poskim. What does it mean that you can't be mesiach das while you're wearing tefillin? We paskin mikra din, like Rabbeinu Yona and the Rush and the Tur, that they take a more lenient view, a narrower view of hesach hadas. Hesach hadas means if you're engaging in levity, behavior that's incompatible with tefillin, that's called hesach hadas. But just going about your mundane business, if you're working, doing something like that, you're eating even a snack, that's not inimical to tefillin, that's compatible with tefillin, that's not called hesach hadas. That is the ikra din. Poskim say, mitzvah min hamuvchar, you should always think about your tefillin, you shouldn't even start thinking about accounting or woodworking or anything else, you should always think about tefillin, that's mitzvah min hamuvchar, but ikra din, many poskim rule, hesach hadas just means that you shouldn't think about something else entirely. You shouldn't think about something that's not appropriate for tefillin. The Vilna Gaon in particular was a strong proponent of this view. The Vilna Gaon felt that people, even ordinary people, not just himself, the Vilna Gaon, but he felt even ordinary people should wear tefillin all day, not like the current practice of wearing only during davening. And he said you can do your business, you can go around your work, you don't have to, even if you're not learning and davening all day, that's not hesach hadas. You can even eat achilas arai, a snack, you can even eat, none of that is incompatible with tefillin, he says. You can't do dvarim b'telim. Dvarim b'telim is anyway you shouldn't be doing dvarim b'telim. You get a double punishment if you do it while you're doing tefillin. Dvarim b'telim not, but a legitimate job, doing something which is a legitimate activity, is perfectly okay to do with tefillin. He says people really should wear tefillin the whole day. Just don't sleep in them. Don't emit flatulence in them. But you can do your ordinary business with tefillin. There are those who disagree. There is an opinion of other poskim that say that anything, even something that's innocent, is not compatible with tefillin. That they bring, that the Shagas Aryeh says kol hesach hadas aser, even daik and other rishonim, even non-inappropriate behavior, even innocent behavior is not compatible with tefillin. And this is also apparently the shita of the Ari. The Arizal was very strict about this. He says you can't be mesiach das from tefillin, even when you're davening, except for Torah and Shemona Esrei. But even other parts of davening, you can't be mesiach das. And they bring a story about the Arizal that he once saw that there was a certain person, Gadol Adar, who was being punished for something, and the punishment was he was mesiach das for tefillin when he said tefillin uvolotzion. He said Yehira tzom lefanecha shlo nigal arik v'lo neled labahala in kedusha uvolotzion, and he was mechaven in that tefillin. He was mesiach das for tefillin, even though he was davening. It wasn't Shemona Esrei, and he was punished for being mesiach das. Certainly us, if we're mesiach das not during davening, even if it's not actually dvarim b'telim, there is an opinion that you can't be mesiach das at all. Ad kedei kach that the Achronim bring that there was the debate. Someone who's being magia Sefer Torah, he's checking the Sefer Torah they're going to use in shul. Even that, some poskim said you shouldn't wear tefillin when you do that because you're focusing on the Sefer Torah. You're not thinking about the tefillin. You have to do a good job and be careful. It's painstaking work to make sure you don't miss anything in the Sefer Torah. Even that's called hesach hadas. Again, the ikra din seems to be not like that. The ikra din seems to be just don't do things that are inappropriate for tefillin. But mitzvah min hamuvchar, you should actually think about the tefillin as much as possible when you wear them. On Daf Ches, the Gemara brings machlokas, Tvila bizmana mitzvah, Rameir savar Tvila bizmana mitzvah, Rameir says Tvila bizmana is mitzvah, Rabbi Yossi says we don't say Tvila bizmana mitzvah. The Gemara is talking about someone who's tamei and is going to the mikvah at the first opportune moment to become tahar. There's a question whether it's a mitzvah to do that or you can just wait and go to the mikvah whenever you want. This is actually a major machlokas poskim when it comes to a woman who's a nida. When a woman gets her period, and then she counts Zayim Nikim, then she goes to the mikvah. There is a major machlokas rishonim whether we apply the rule of tefillah b'zman mitzvah or not. Rabbeinu Chananel and other rishonim said tefillah b'zman mitzvah. Beis Yosef explained even b'zman hazeh, as we've discussed previously, b'zman hazeh we're machmer midrabanan, we're machmer for a chashash of zava gedola. It's anyway not really at the right time on a deraisa level, but since according to the minhag of Bnos Yisrael, it's a din today, it's an absolutely binding din of Bnos Yisrael, achmiru al atzman, to wait 7 nikiyim, even if that's not strictly required midin midaraisa, that's the first time a woman can go to the mikvah, al pi the halacha that we follow, and therefore that is called, according to some Rishonim, tefillah b'zmana mitzvah. Other Rishonim say no. Other Rishonim say tefillah b'zmana is not a tefillah. The other Rishonim say that we do not do. Rabbeinu Tam said tefillah b'zmana lav mitzvah. since our women anyway are not going on, there is machlokes in the Gemara, even when you are going on the right day. Certainly today, Rabbeinu Tam says, our women don't go on the seventh day midaraisa. We don't say tefillah b'zman mitzvah. What's the nafkamina if we paskin for a woman going to the mikvah, tefillah b'zman mitzvah or not? The nafkamina is whether you can go to the mikvah on Shabbos. Some Rishonim say you can only go to the mikvah if tefillah b'zman mitzvah. You can only go on Shabbos if it's a mitzvah. And also they talk about during Avelos or during Tisha B'Av, if a woman goes to the mikvah, that if tefillah b'zman mitzvah, it's a mitzvah. So even though we normally don't bathe on those days, if it's a mitzvah, then we do. If it's not a mitzvah, then we don't. Our minhag certainly is that we don't go on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, but the Shabbos we do go. But in terms of how we actually paskin, the Beis Yosef explains that our shita is, he says, we do not paskin tefillah b'zman mitzvah, and he brings another implication. He says a woman whose husband is not around, he says that the women typically don't go to the mikveh. Some posts can talk about mystical reasons why she shouldn't go, but certainly she doesn't make a point of going. If her husband is not around, a woman will often not make a point of going to the mikveh because there's no practical utility to it. If you hold tefillah b'zman mitzvah, then you should, even if there's no husband around. So the we paskin tefillah b'zman lav mitzvah, that's how we paskin in the Shulchan Aruch, except that the Beis Yosef adds, and he paskins that way in the Shulchan Aruch, that even though tefillah b'zman lav mitzvah, if the husband is around, then it is actually a mitzvah to do the tefillah b'zmana, so they can fulfill the mitzvah of pru revu, of procreation. It's not appropriate to miss an opportunity. So that's how we paskin in the Shulchan Aruch. If Baila is be'er, if her husband is around and will be with her, then she should go to the mikveh b'zmana, not because tefillah b'zmana mitzvah, but because to avoid failing to fulfill a mitzvah of pru revu. We do paskin muteris litful b'Shabbos, even though tefillah b'zmana lav mitzvah, women do go to the mikveh on Friday night. There is a whole discussion if she could have gone earlier and she didn't, and she was negligent, whether we still allow you to go Friday night. But b'ikra din, on the one hand, we paskin tefillah b'zmana lav mitzvah, at least b'zman hazeh, where anyway she's not being tovelas on the right day. On the other hand, in general, it still is a mitzvah in terms of pru revu. And in terms of Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, we don't go to the mikveh, and Shabbos we generally do, although there are certain cases where the poskim debate it. On Daf Tes, we have some Agadita. The Gemara gives reasons for various tragedies that befell Klal Yisrael, in particular the destruction of various versions of the Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash. Why was Shiloh destroyed? Because there were two great averos, Gilui Arayos and Bizayon Kudshim. Immorality, sexual immorality, and treating Kudshim disgracefully. Why was the first Beis HaMikdash destroyed? The three cardinal averos, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim, idolatry, sexual immorality, murder. Second Beis HaMikdash wasn't those averos. They studied Torah, they fulfilled mitzvahs, they did milas chasadim. Why was it destroyed? Famous Gemara, sinas chinam, baseless hatred. This week's parsha, l'sisnes achicha b'lvavecha. That's it. You see that's as terrible as the three cardinal averos of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichas Dam. So the Gemara clearly considers it legitimate to try to interpret tragedy. We don't take the modern view that we don't blame anyone. God is unknowable. The traditional view, of course, is that when tragedy befalls us, we try to interpret it. And more than that, we don't just say in general it's because of sin. We actually name sins. We actually pick concrete sins. We try to figure out what have we done wrong. What is the specific avera that we did, that our ancestors did, and we try to interpret the tragedy from that perspective. Rambam, in a famous passage in the beginning of Hilchas Tanis, Rambam says when tragedy befalls a person, he's supposed to say it's because we sinned, because of Masayim Harayim. It's because of the person has to say that the tzara came for a reason. If we don't do that, if we just say it's mikra, it's just happenstance, the punishments will get even worse. A person is supposed to say it's because of sins. And there are a number of famous cases in the Achronim where they actually interpreted famous national catastrophes, national tragedies, on specific averos. The Chassid Yavetz, Rabbi Yosef Yavetz, after the Spanish expulsion, he says it was because even though they learned Torah, they were too interested in philosophy. They weren't learning Torah properly, Torah Lishma. They were drawn after philosophy, and he blames the expulsion from Spain on this failure to learn Torah properly, and instead they studied philosophy. Rabbi Yaakov Emden blames all the Tzaras from Golos in an impassioned plea for Jews to make Aliyah. He says Jews have been neglecting Eretz Yisrael. That's why the Jews were expelled from Spain. All of Eretz Yisrael, because we haven't learned our lesson back since the time of the Meraglim, when they were Moes Be'eretz Chemda. Jews have to care about Eretz Yisrael, not just pay lip service to it. It's not enough to face Yerushalayim when you daven. You do that when you can't go to Eretz Yisrael. When you can't go to Yerushalayim, if you could, you have to. And because we neglect Yerushalayim, we think we found a new Yerushalayim in Gullus. That's why the various tzaras, in particular the Spanish expulsion, have befallen Jewry. And in particular, he said, and elsewhere actually, he blames various tzaras on the study of philosophy, like the Chassid Yavetz. I don't know if they're related, but the Chassid Yavetz was much earlier. He says that Tach V'Tat, the Rav Emden says that the destruction of the Jews in the Ukraine, he says that there was a tremendous flowering of Torah in the Jewish community. He says, but he said there was a tremendous flowering of success. Hashiru, he says, they were rich. I don't know if he said they also were Gedolei Torah involved there, but he says that they were also Chasidei Olam. He says, nevertheless, the plague of philosophy, Mispacha Shel Philosophia. We see that he brings rayas to that. He says that's why Kodesh Baruch Hu destroyed them. The Chasim Sofer talks about the famous earthquake in Tzfas. He says that the 1837, I think it was. He says that the earthquake was a consequence of the Kinas Yerushalayim. Jews were going to Tzfas and were neglecting Yerushalayim. They were punished for that, and they were, and it was a slap in the face to Yerushalayim, and the Jews were punished by the earthquake in Tzfas. He actually takes aim at Lag BaOmer, coming up soon. He takes aim at Lag BaOmer. He says that everyone goes to Tzfas. They all forget Aliyah. He says everyone should go to Yerushalayim. All they care about is going to Tzfas to celebrate Rosh Hashanah Bar Yochai. He doesn't understand. Whoever heard of making a Yom Tov to celebrate the death of a tzaddik is supposed to have it's a somber day. It's a day of mourning. The whole thing is wrong, he says. And in particular, it was the neglect of Yerushalayim that led to the earthquake in Tzfas. Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzensky, the Achiezer, writing on the eve of the Holocaust, right before he died, he said that he's kristallnacht, the signs of terrible things he saw in Europe. He said, this is such a terrible thing. He says that why is this happening? He says that the problems are coming from the West, from Germany. He says because the West is where the assimilation is, the reform. He says that's where the problems are. People are abandoning Torah and mitzvahs, he says. And people should realize that this problem is a wake-up call, that we need to shapru maseichem, we have to improve. After World War II, Rav Avigdor Miller, sometimes a lightning rod for controversy, he had no problem. He was quite explicit in blaming the Holocaust on the sinful tendencies of European Jewry. He says they were warned by the Nevi'im. The worst defection from the Torah since the beginning of our nation's history had taken place in Europe, and was therefore visited by the greatest retribution in history. Rav Adi Yosef got in trouble a couple of times. He said soldiers die. Why do soldiers in the Israeli army die? They don't keep the Torah. Used to be soldiers were Yireim. If a person did Averis, he would leave the war, he would go home. Today the soldiers are not Shomrei Torah mitzvahs, they're not Dati. Why are you surprised if they die? He said, that we have casualties. There was a firestorm of controversy. Rav Adi Yosef actually had great respect for the soldiers always. He always recognized their great contribution to the security of Israel. But he was not afraid to say things like this. There were those who disagreed, particularly with regard to the Holocaust. The Lubavitcher Rebbe used to say this is something unique. This is not something we can interpret in terms of chait, in terms of schar v'onesh. But historically, as we see in our Gemara, the traditional Jewish response to tragedy, even national tragedy, even things like the destruction of the temple, is to give concrete reasons, to give specific concrete averis that we did in order to prompt us to tshuva. The Gemara in Daf Yud, Gemara has a long discussion of the laws of mezuzah. The Gemara brings a question whether a sukkah needs a mezuzah. Sukkah sachag b'chag. Does a sukkah on sukkahs need a mezuzah? Rabbi Yehuda says chayav. The Chum say pater. The Gemara discusses what they're arguing about. The conclusion of the Gemara is that the Rabbi Yehuda says sukkah is diras keva. We're used to saying sukkah is diras arai, a temporary dwelling. Rabbi Yehuda dissents. Rabbi Yehuda says sukkah is diras keva, so a diras keva needs a mezuzah. The Chum say sukkah is a diras arai, and therefore it does not need a mezuzah. So that's how we paskin. We paskin sukkah is diras arai, does not need a mezuzah. There is a discussion. So a typical temporary sukkah doesn't need a mezuzah. What about a real house? Some people just remove a roof, or they have a roof that retracts and they put on schach, but the sukkah is the house. So are you still chayiv in mezuzah? Normally it's not much of an issue. If you had a mezuzah all year, you leave it there for sukkahs. But that's actually machlokas. There's actually machlokas. Some say that because it's now being used as a sukkah, it acquires the status of diras arai and does not need a mezuzah. If your mezuzah falls off on sukkahs, you can wait till after sukkahs to put it back up. Others say no, that this is a house. This is a diras kva. Sukkah can be a diras arai. A purpose-built sukkah is a diras arai. But this house is a house. It always was a house. So it stays a diras kva and it needs a mezuzah. There is, consequently, there's an interesting debate whether after sukkahs you should, in such a situation, whether you should remove the mezuzah and put it back on. There is a halacha of tasa v'lo min ha'asui. If a mezuzah is put up in a situation where you're not chayav, before you finish building the house, you stick up a mezuzah on a pole before there's a door or anything, and then that's not good. And when you build the rest of the house, you take the mezuzah off and you put it back on. So some say that since sukkahs achag b'chag is not chayav in mezuzah, even if it's a real house, so then you were potter for 7 days, and now you're chayav again, you take the mezuzah off and you put it back on. Others say no. Others say that since it was originally put on behechsher, originally you put mezuzah on, it was a regular house, then it became potter for 7 days and chayav again. That's a big machlokes in general, where the tasav lamanasi applies in a case where the initial establishment of the mitzvah was proper, was when there was a chiyuv, and then it became potter, and then it became chayav again. That's a machlokes. But so there are those who say that if you use your house as a sukkah, you actually should replace the mezuzahs, take them off, and put them back on after sukkahs. That's a machlokes. And a final question about this same question is that some poskim actually say that in some cases, when you convert a room in your house to a sukkah, you have to move the mezuzah for sukkahs to the other side of the doorway. Normally the halacha is, the rule of mezuzah is, it's when you go into the house, and as you go deeper into a house, each time you put mezuzah on the right side of the door as you go in, so right side of the front door, and then if you have an interior room, the right side of the door from the first room to the second room, and so on. So if your sukkah is an interior room, it'll typically have a mezuzah on the right side going into the sukkah from the house. But if a sukkah is potter, then the sukkah itself doesn't need a mezuzah, but the other side of that door is the house. So the mezuzah needs to be on the side of the house that you'd be going in from the sukkah. So the direction would switch. So some poskim say that during sukkahs you need to switch the mezuzah to the side going into the house, not the side going from the house into the sukkah. Others say you don't have to, either because many poskim say that a sukkah is chayiv if it's a real house, and if you just converted your sukkah into a house, you leave the mezuzah on the same side because the sukkah itself is a real house. And others say it doesn't matter, even according to the shita that you're potter on sukkahs, but you don't change the mezuzah. The rule is you always put a mezuzah on the right side of the doorway, the way you typically pass through the doorway. So even though if we would say al pi lamdus and halacha that switches during sukkahs, since for most of the year the way you go through the doorway is this way, you don't change the mezuzah just for the 7 days of sukkahs. Again, continuing the discussion of mezuzah on Daf Yud Aleph, the Gemara brings a brisa. Mezuzahs yachid nivdekes pamayim b'shavua. An individual's mezuzah is checked twice in 7 years. V'shal rabim pamayim b'yovel. Mezuzah of rabim, of a community mezuzah, is checked only twice in 50 years. Our mezuzahs are typically mezuzahs yachid, regular house mezuzahs. There is a discussion about mezuzahs in communal places like apartment buildings, stairwells that are shared by different people. There is some debate about that, how to look at that. But a typical house mezuzah in a private house should be checked twice in 7 years. It's a funny way of expressing once in every 3.5 years. Some poskim say it means once in every 3.5 years. Some poskim say the fact that they said twice in 7 years means in the fourth year. Doesn't have to be exactly halfway through. You should check it. It doesn't have to be exactly 3.5. It should be a cycle of twice in 7 years. The poskim explain you check it because it might have gotten damaged. Water might have gotten in, moisture, or letters might have started to run. So you're not checking you don't have to be an expert sofer to check it. You're just checking to see if the letters were damaged. That when you bought the mezuzah the first time, it was checked by a sofer, so you know it was initially kosher. Its initial state was kosher. The only question is whether it got damaged later. So you need to take it off, open it up, look to make sure the letters are all intact, and then you put it back on, and you put it back up. You don't make a new bracha when you put it back up. That's at least what some posts can say, that we don't make a new bracha when we put it back on the wall. There is, however, a major debate as to. I think that's the halacha that we don't make. The meaning is we don't make a new bracha when we put it back. There is a major debate, however, what should a person do while the mezuzahs are off? You need to get loaner replacement mezuzahs to put on for the duration that mezuzahs are off and are in the waiting to be checked by the sofer or by you? So that actually is a machlokes. Some poskim say you absolutely should, that you should put up new mezuzahs, and if you do put up a new mezuzah, you make a bracha on the new mezuzah you're putting up because this is a new mezuzah. But there are poskim who say that you don't need to put up a new mezuzah. The Das Kedoshim, the B'Shatcher, he says that assuming you're not taking them off for a very long period, just for the minimum amount of time it takes to check the mezuzah, then you don't have to put on a new mezuzah. Even more than that, the Sefer Kviyas Mezuzah Kilchasa brings that he heard in the name of Rav Menashe Klein, the author of the Mishnah Halachos, that if you take it off even for a few days, if that's the standard way of doing it, if it typically takes a few days, you don't need to put up a new mezuzah because that's normal. That's the life cycle of a mezuzah. You don't make a new bracha, even if they were off for a few days, he says, because that's the derech, that's not a hesach hadas. So even a few days, he says, you don't have to. On the other hand, the author of Kviyas Mezuzah Kilchasa himself, he says that you should put up a new mezuzah. He brings that from various poskim. He brings from Nissen Karelitz of the Chazon Ish used to keep. We have a spare tire. Chazon Ish would have a spare mezuzah, so he would take off mezuzahs one at a time. The one he took off, he would replace it with the spare. Check the one he was checking, and then go through all the mezuzahs like that, but never having any doorway, never having any part of the house without a mezuzah. He brings from Rav Deblitsky, the Marash, the Rav, I think Shroya Deblitsky, that he said that if you take it off for one day, that you take it off in the morning, you put it back at night, the minhag gets to make. Rav Menashe Klein said even a few days if that's normal. Rav Deblitsky said at least if it's one day, the minhag gets to make. But for many days, then he says, Rav Deblitsky says, then you should put up a new mezuzah in between. The Sefer Emek Bracha he brings says that Chazal wanted you to check it, and they didn't require you to take off to put on a new mezuzah, even though mezuzah is a chi of every minute that you have a house, you have to have a mezuzah. Chazal wanted to be reasonable, so they'll let you take it off without requiring you to go find a new one. The Sefer Kviyas Mezuzah Kilchasa, he says it's hard to understand. Even if Chazal have the right to do that, why would they do that? It's a din daraisa. Even if Chazal have the koach to be oker davar at Torah b'shev al tasa, why would you assume they did that? Certainly today, he says, when replacement mezuzahs are readily available, we have gemachs. He reiterates this a couple of times. Certainly a person should try to find loaner mezuzahs, find replacement mezuzahs for his mezuzahs while he takes them off to check them, although he admits that there are some poskim who say that if it's only a day, or even if it's for a few days, if it's normal, and the Das Kedoshim, that if you just take it off for as much time as you need to check it, there are poskim who say that you don't need to put up a new mezuzah while you're checking the one that you've taken off.